Points on a map. Wouldn't it be cool if this map had points on it representing cities? I came across this World Cities database by Simple Maps, and I downloaded the free version. I did some pre-processing to exclude cities smaller than 50,000 and remove all rows except city, latitude, longitude, country, and population, and I posted it as this gist. This is what the table looks like. The main thing we need is latitude and longitude to make points on the map. The idea here is to take this data set and load it into this program and put points on this map. I'll get started by forking this visualization and renaming it to Points on a Map. All right, the first thing I'm going to do here is load in the data. To get the gist URL that I can load in the program, I'm going to click on this raw button right here. And then I'll copy this URL and I'll paste it somewhere in here. I see we already have a use data module. This module is loading in the World Atlas data. We could take a couple different paths here. We could make this use data module responsible for loading in the population data as well, or we could make a different module that is just responsible for the one thing of loading in the population data, using similar patterns to what we're using here. My gut tells me it might be cleaner to have two separate hooks that load the different data sets and are just responsible each for a single thing. I'll delete this console.log just so it doesn't clutter things up. Since we're going to have two different use data hooks, I think I'll rename this one to use World Atlas, and I'll rename this file to use World Atlas. And then in index.js, we need to use that new name wherever we had use data from before. All right, now that we're back in working order, I'm going to make a new file. I'll call it usecities.js. And while we're here in index.js, I think I'll import it. Import usecities from usecities. And then we can say const cities equals usecities. And then I'll put a console.log cities. Now let's implement this module usecities. It's very similar to use World Atlas, so I'm just going to copy paste this whole thing into usecities, and I'll rename it to usecities. And instead of JSON URL, this will be CSV URL, and this is where we can paste this gist URL. And instead of loading JSON, we're going to load CSV of CSV URL. And we need to import CSV from D3. We do not need these topo.json imports here. And I don't think we need React either. We just need useState and useEffect. Now, since all we're getting as input here is going to be the data loaded from the CSV file, I'm just going to use setData as the callback. Now, this array of 4,660 cities is printed out in the console. Now we've got all our cities available. This is sweet. We probably should parse these latitude-longitude values from strings into numbers at the time that we load in the data, so we don't have to do it on every render. To do that, I'll pass a row accessor, and then I'll define row to be a function that takes as input one row D and returns that row D, but before doing so sets d.lat to plus d.lat. This unary plus operator parses the string into a number. And we'll do the same for LNG longitude. By the way, it's called unary plus because it's a unary operation. An operation with only one operand, meaning a single input. In math, an example of a unary operator is minus. Unary minus, as in -2. In math, you don't need unary plus, but in JavaScript, unary plus parses strings into numbers. Now that we've parsed latitude and longitude strings into numbers, we can see in our console output that, in fact, they no longer have quotes around them, meaning that they're numbers. All right, we've successfully loaded in the data alongside our other TopoJSON data, so we have all the ingredients we need to put these points on the map. Let's take a look at index.js. We've got still a sort of ambiguous name here, data. I think I'll change this to be World Atlas, and we're passing that into marks as data, which I'll also change to World Atlas. Since I know it's working now, I'll delete this console.log. And since I also know that the marks component is going to need our cities, I'm going to pass that in as well as a prop called cities. Now in our marks component, instead of unpacking data, we need to unpack World Atlas. And we can also unpack a new prop called cities. Oh no, we've got an error. Data is not defined in index.js. Oh yeah, here we're checking if data exists. Ah, this is actually a point where we need to do some modifications, because it's loading if either the TopoJSON is still loading or the cities data is still loading. What we can do here is say if there's no World Atlas loaded yet, or there are no cities loaded yet, then display our loading indicator. Otherwise, keep going and render everything. By the way, those two bars, that's the logical OR operator of JavaScript. True or true returns true. False or true returns true. True or false returns true. Only if both of the operands are false does the OR operator return false. That's the logical OR operator in a nutshell. All right, now we can go back over to marks.js and add the new logic for rendering our cities. We can do that right down here. We can say cities.map. Let's say it takes as input D, one city. And what we need to do is project each of these latitude, longitude points. And it turns out D3 projections are also functions. When you call a projection as a function, it returns an array of x and y pixel coordinates that correspond to the latitude and longitude coordinates that you pass into it. According to the documentation, a projection takes as input a point and returns a new array of xy, typically in pixels. The point must be specified as a two-element array, longitude and latitude. So I didn't quite get that right. First of all, it needs to be an array. And second of all, longitude comes first, before latitude. All right, let's see if these x and y values are even getting populated by saying console.log x and y. All right, these seem to be correct. These look pretty good to me. Now, all we need to do is use these as the cx and cy values for some circles that we put on the map. So we can return a circle whose cx is equal to x comes from here, and whose cy is equal to y. And in order for it to show up, we need to specify some radius. I'll say 4. And boom, look at that. We got some points on the map. I'd like to make these really tiny, let's say 1 pixel radius. And I'd like to make them pop out more against the background. We can do that in our styles.css by first making the background map very light and subtle. I'll use the Chrome DevTools to pick a nice color for the land masses. And then I'll copy this color hex code into our CSS for the land. Now the interiors are a bit stark, these borders. Again, I'll use the Chrome DevTools to find a relatively unobtrusive color for those. And then I'll copy that color into our CSS for the interiors. And now we can add some CSS that applies to circles. I'd like to set the fill to be that same color we had before. There we go. And I think opacity might be a nice touch. If we set the opacity to say 0.3, we can start to see some density of cities. And what if I make the radius just a bit larger, maybe 2 pixels? Now it looks a little blurry. 1.5 looks okay. And then I'll just take another pass at all the colors to make the background as muted as I can, while also preserving the ability to see what's there, including the graticules, the land, and the internal borders. All right, that's how you can add points on a map. That's all for points on a map.